start with this. Well, as previously reported here on the channel approximately 4 weeks ago, it does appear that Jesse Hart and Joe Smith Jr. are going to be locking horns early next year on January 11th at the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino in Atlantic City. On the undercard for their fight, we're going to see the return of Rob Brandt. This will be his first fight since losing that rematch to Ryota Murata. And Rob is going to be squaring off against an opponent that has yet to be announced. I'm very curious who it's going to be because Top Rank doesn't have the hold over the middleweight division that they have over the light heavyweight division or the lightweight division or the super featherweight division. There's other divisions where they've got a lot of ponies in the show and they can make a lot of fights. But in the case of the middleweight division, they don't quite have a fix on that weight class that they have in some others. So I'm very curious as to who they're going to get to fight Rob Brandt on this card. Now back to the main event of that same card, the fight between Jesse Hart and Joe Smith Jr. Well, my sentiments haven't changed. That this is a great fight because neither one of these two guys is a defensive wizard. Thus, they are both subject to each other's offense, to each other's power. I think that this fight is yet another good litmus test for Jesse Hart, who squared off against Sullivan Barrera in his last fight, and I gotta say it, Jesse didn't impress me in that fight, okay? That was a test, and he passed that test, but he didn't really pass it with flying colors.
Kinda just nicked it for me.
Against a big puncher like Joe Smith Jr., who's good for landing a big shot, who's good for scoring a knockdown, the question then becomes, can Jesse Hart's boxing see him through this fight, through 12 rounds, with a big puncher, big bruiser?
Like Joe Smith Jr.
With a dog in him, you know? Can his boxing see him through 12 rounds with the likes of a Joe Smith Jr.? Interesting matchup. I'm all for it. I'll say that if by some chance Jesse wins this fight, hypothetically speaking, is it the biggest victory in the world? No, it's not. But
still an important one.
It is a good experience fight. It is the kind of fight that he needs to have a future in the light heavyweight division where there are no shortage of punchers. Just about anybody and everybody holding a belt in this weight class, they're a puncher.
Got to get ready for them.
So it's only natural that you acclimate to this weight class with a puncher in this division, a sizable puncher. I think Joe Smith Jr.'s got what it takes to make things interesting, and if Jesse's not careful, Joe Smith Jr. might surprise it. Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of fight. So for the boxing fan out there who's not too big on finesse fighting kind of guys, hit, not get hit, stick and move, moving target kind of guys, for the boxing fan who's not too keen on those kinds of matchups, well, you might like this one, because I think this one promises to be a genuine punch-up. Jesse is not a finished product. He doesn't strike me as a complete fighter. There are defensive holes there that Joe Smith Jr. can exploit, and it is for this reason that I think this is going to be a Donnybrook. This is going to be a real punch-up, this one. So keep your eyes peeled for this on January 11th. Elsewhere in the boxing world, a fight on that same date, January 11th. A fight between Jaime Munguia and Spike O'Sullivan is being planned to take place somewhere in San Antonio, Texas. Essentially, if that fight comes off, it is going to be competing with the Jesse Hart versus Joe Smith Jr. fight. And it's still in the air as to whether or not Jaime Munguia's WBO junior middleweight title is going to be on the line. They could stage this as a junior middleweight contest, it being that Jaime's junior middleweight champion and Gary Spike O'Sullivan's last fight, it was within the junior middleweight limit. He scored a 6th-round TKO stoppage
against Karen Gray
over Kiari Gray, his second consecutive victory since being knocked out by David Lemieux way back when. I'm sure you guys remember. So Gary's on the up and up. He's won his last 2 fights. His last one was within 154 pounds, so it's possible that Jaime could be defending that WBO title against him. However, comparatively, I have to say that if both of those fights are going to be happening on the same night, I find the top rank card, the one with Jesse Hart squaring off against Joe Smith Jr., I find that to be a more intriguing fight, a fight that has a bigger, better air of spontaneity as to what might happen, because it's not a foregone conclusion that Jesse wins that fight, and it's not a foregone conclusion that Joe wins that fight. Whereas in the case of Jaime Munguia and Spike O'Sullivan, whether the fight's at 154 or the fight's at 160, I'd still more or less favor Jaime Munguia to win the fight. You know, it's not a question of either or, because I can actually watch both of those fights at the same time. It's really just a question of who ends up on my TV and who ends up on my phone. And I have to say that, as far as my flat screen and which fight I would watch there, it would be the top-ranked fight. And I'd be tuning in, between the breaks or whatever, to the Jaime Munguia versus Spike O'Sullivan card on my mobile phone, on my mobile device, on my DAZN app. I have to say that comparatively, I do like Hart versus Smith Jr. a bit more than I like Munguia versus O'Sullivan. No likelihood O'Sullivan might get stopped. Guy's 35 years old, fighting at 154. How durable can he be down there, And if you think about it at 160, it's more or less the same thing. This guy did get stopped in one round by David Lemieux. And while I don't necessarily think Jaime packs quite the same punch as David Lemieux, the kid is aggressive. He is a big kid, and he is a puncher. He's really growing into his own. So it's conceivable that he stops Gary Spike O'Sullivan. Whereas in the case of Joe and Jesse, it's a crapshoot. Anything can happen. And I like those kinds of fights, the kind where I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. So the battle of who ends up on the TV versus who ends up on the phone, it looks like if those two fights happen on the same night, I'm going to be watching that top-ranked fight on my TV and that Munguia fight on my phone. In other news, the fight between Katarina Thanders and Danila Ramos for what was the WBC's interim championship at 130 pounds, well, the outcome has been determined, the victor has been decided, and much as I expected, Katarina Thanders, a very bloody Katarina Thanders, did manage to win a decision over Danila Ramos. This is more or less what I expected to happen. And winning that interim title aligns Katarina for what is the full version of the title. It allows her to contend for it against the WBC Super Featherweight Champion, Eva Wahlström. The thing is that Eva Wahlström, she may be participating in what is an 8-rounder before the year is out, and moving on from that to defend her title against none other than Terry Harper, an announcement made by Eddie Hearn not too long ago. Thus, even though Katarina is in line for the fight, she may not be Eva Wahlström's next opponent or her opponent after next. So it being that the full champion could be tied up for at least the next 1 to 2 fights, what should the interim champion Katarina Thanders do in the in-between time? Well, there are reports circulating that she's going to be squaring off against Mekhaled, the former interim champion who lost the title under what appeared to be some very sketchy circumstances. You see, Mekhaled did not willingly relinquish the WBC's interim title. This was a decision that was made by her handlers. For some reason, they so decided to vacate the title, and that's what made it available for Katarina Thanders and Danila Ramos to fight for. You gotta wonder why they made that decision. What went into it? What could they have been thinking? Saving money on sanctioning fees, perhaps? Or, I don't know. Did someone give them a cash incentive to vacate the title as to make it available for someone else? The imagination can run wild with that particular element of the story. That Mekhaled's former handlers, because she has since parted ways with them, they made the decision to vacate the title without her knowledge. She has since moved on, partnered up with someone else. Better still, reports indicate that Katarina Thanders, the interim champion, the newly crowned interim champion, is going to be squaring off against the former interim champion later on this year on December 22nd. If the story checks out, if the story sticks, and it is to happen that way, I have to say that I'm all for it. I'm all for it because I got a soft spot for Elem. She wanted to contend for the full version of the title, and she had the hardware to do it. And due to some circumstance, that opportunity was taken from her. Well, as luck would have it, Katarina seems, at least based on these reports, she seems receptive to giving her an opportunity to get that interim title back. And you know what? Katarina and Elem, they were actually supposed to fight over a year ago, but the fight didn't come off. One thing led to another, and Elem ended up fighting someone else. Well, here, she's got a second chance, and at least based on these reports, the fight's supposed to be going down in Lyon, France on December 22nd at the end of this year. This will be Elem's opportunity to win that interim title back and realign herself for either Eva Wahlström or the winner of Wahlström versus Harper. I think that this is the adequate preparation for either of these two girls, either Katarina or LM. It being that iron sharpens iron. And if you end up challenging Eva or you end up challenging Terry, one way or another, you've got to keep the tools sharp. You can't just sit on your hands waiting for a phone call. You've got to make things happen. And I think that them squaring off against each other is the adequate preparation they need to stay on their P's and Q's. Because whether it's Terry Harper or Eva Wallstrom, regardless of who wins that fight, they will be the most formidable opponent that either one of these girls has faced so far. As it stands, they both have a common opponent in Danila Ramos, a common opponent that they both have beaten. But Danila is she's not Eva, and she don't punch like Terry. So they need to keep the tool sharp. This is welcome news that, in spite of LM getting a raw deal from her former handlers, she is being given a second chance, a second crack at that interim title. Risky business on the part of Katarina Thanders because, well, LM is a formidable fighter. She is a polished boxer, This ain't no walk in the park. And if the story checks out and the fight comes off, there are considerable risks. I mean, she is running the risk of losing the interim title that she just won. But, hey, from where a fight fan is sitting, this is welcome news. And I'm sure that, from where LM is sitting, this is welcome news. So, just keep your eyes peeled for that on December 22nd, and we'll talk more about the fight as the fight date approaches. And finally, Chris Eubank Jr. had this to say in regards to his return to the middleweight division, having been up there at super middleweight. He says after he beats Matt Korobov, he's got his sights set on Jermall Charlo. In the article, he talks about his fan-friendly style, how he thinks it will be appealing to the American fight fans, and that Jermall is perceived as one of the top guys in the middleweight division. Thus, once he sparks out Matt Korobov, he's going to be looking to fight him next. And this is something that I more or less predicted, that Chris Eubank Jr. is on the PBC side of the street. And for a guy on the PBC side of the street, if he's going to be a middleweight, if he's going to be campaigning in that division, well, there's not much left to do but fight a Jermall Charlo, and the same applies in reverse for Jermall. The names that you're looking to fight, they don't think much of you. So the best thing you can do is keep busy with the likes of a Chris Eubank Jr., and I honestly think that that's a great fight. I don't know that the fight itself is living up to its full potential if it happens on the shores of the United States, because comparatively, I would say that Eubank Jr. is a name that could get you some money in the UK, but better still, hey, it seems that they want this fight to happen in America, so in all likelihood, that's where it's going to happen. I just don't think that they're going to get as big of a return here in the States than what they would get over there in the UK.
Fuck it.
Funny thing about this fight, both of these guys have got to get through someone else for it to happen. We know that Jermall Charlo is going to be fighting Dennis Hogan, and we also know that in order for Chris Eubank Jr. to challenge Jermall Charlo for that green belt, he's got to make his way past Matt Korobov. Oddly enough, the fight with Matt Korobov is, forget this, not a WBC interim title, but a WBA interim title. Now, slow down for a second and think about it. You've got Canelo Alvarez, who is the WBA's super champion, the full champion, the only champion holding a version of the belt that can be unified with that of another organization's. Then you've got the world champion, or the regular champion, Ryota Murata. He's holding that version of that belt. And in this fight, apparently, there's going to be a vacant interim title, a vacant interim WBA title on the line. As if these divisions aren't diluted enough with all kinds of trinkets and all kinds of world titles, with all kinds of designations, the WBA in all their wisdom so decides to put an interim title on the line. I think that this interim title would align the winner for a Ryota Murata fight as opposed to a Canelo Alvarez fight. Not that it matters, because I don't see the winner of this fight challenging either Canelo or Ryota Murata. In all likelihood, the winner of this fight, if it's Chris Eubank, if it's Chris, he'll challenge Jermall Charlo. Now, if the winner is Matt Korobov, I could see Matt potentially challenging Ryota Murata. Don't look for Canelo to give you the time of day. That's up to him, and there's no telling if he will or where he will pop up next. Because lest we forget, this guy is the WBO champion at 175 pounds, while simultaneously being the WBA champion, the full WBA champion, at 160 pounds. You know what? Never mind, Canelo. Back to Chris Eubank Jr. and Matt Korobov, and what it means depending on who wins. If Matt wins the fight, right? I don't think Jermall Charlo is going to be too keen on giving Matt a rematch because Jamal's going to be thinking to himself, well, what do I get out of fighting him for a second time? You know, he's not a big name. It's not a big money fight. There's nobody clamoring for a rematch, so Jermall might not actually give him a second fight, in which case Matt would be coming off a win, and he would be the WBA interim champion at 160. That does align him for a Murata fight. And since Matt isn't a pivotal fixture to the PBC's bottom line, it is mildly possible that maybe he crosses the street, fights Murata in Japan, makes himself a pretty penny. Because Murata's worth some money in Japan the same way he knew he's worth some money in Japan. I could see that happening. Now, if it's Chris, it's a different situation because there's a lot more intrigue associated with a Chris Eubank versus Jermall Charlo fight than a Jermall Charlo versus Matt Korobov rematch. If Chris wins, I can see the Charlo fight happening. That'd be a great fight. The thing is, Chris has got to make it past Matt. And Matt is a guy that comes from a good amateur background. He is a formidable contender in the middleweight division. A fight between the two really could be an all-action fight. But in an all-action fight, well, that does tend to favor the younger guy, and that's Chris. It's possible that given the pace of a high-octane fight against an aging fighter like Matt Korobov, given the pace of the match, maybe Chris wears him out because, you know, Matt, he's got boxing acumen, but he's a very aggressive guy. And Chris Eubank Jr., he's also a very aggressive guy. Throws a lot of punches. Chris has his limitations. We talk about them all the time, but Matt Korobov being as aggressive as he is, I'm not sure that he's going to exploit them, rather engage in them, play into them. Because what Chris is looking for is a firefight, and Matt might be looking for one too. But, you know, it just so happens that Matt, what's he in his mid to late 30s or something like that? Mid to late 30s, you want to get in a firefight with a young guy who has a good engine? You know. It is intriguing because in a lot of ways, Matt Korobov is a more polished boxer and more experienced than Chris Eubank Jr., but Matt is also getting long in the tooth. If he goes in there mashing the gas pedal against the younger guy, well, he might be the one that crashes. I said it before and I'll say it again. Eubank versus Korobov is more intriguing than the main event of that same card.